In this one, we're going to talk about making our own camera object and using tiles to make our rooms look a lot nicer. This one should be a good breath of fresh air after the last one, which was a good bit more complicated, and it should be fun to make our game just look a little bit nicer. Now, if you know how to use tiles and everything already, that's well and good. In this one, I just cover a couple ways to handle the depth for your tile layers and stuff like that, the simplest ways possible in GameMaker right now. So definitely watch for that and watch for, reasons why we might want to do it a certain way or why tile layer depth is important. So if we have layers that we want to be on top of the player, that kind of thing. And making our own camera object is pretty important because it gives us a lot of freedom to do stuff later like camera shaking and things like that. So yeah, even if you're a little familiar with this stuff, this will be a really good one to watch. So definitely watch it, but this one can maybe be a little bit more relaxing. So yeah, good luck. I want to make my room look pretty. It has looked ugly for all of these videos now. And not only do I want to make my room look pretty, I also want to make it bigger so the player can run around and have a bigger play space. So like I said last time, you probably already know how to do this, especially if you watched my RPG series. But really quick, I'm just going to add in my tile set from my other project, and I'm going to put in some tile layers. I'll walk through it again, but I'm going to walk through it really quickly, and I'm going to go over one or two minor little differences in how I'm going to do them in this project for gameplay purposes. So definitely still watch, even if you know, but like I said, I'll go through it fast. So first of all, you need to create your tile set in a sprite. So do that real quick. I'm going to import mine. Like I said, just a sprite. So first of all, we obviously have the water. So as with everything we have on here, we have the edge of the water, so like edge pieces, and then we have the little corner pieces for rounding out sort of concave indents into the water or whatever. So, this piece would lead to water with an edge here and water with an edge here. So it's doing 6 little rounding pieces, 1 at the corners and 2 for opposite sided corners. Tile sets can potentially have a ton of different pieces. I'm just going to be doing a 16 size tile set. The two common ones, especially in GameMaker, are 16 tiles worth of tiling. So you have these 9 plus these 6, which is 15, and then basically a negative space. So that would be 16 for a complete thing like this water. Or there's also a method for doing 47 tiles, which is a bit more dynamic, but obviously a bit more work and larger tile set sizes. So for this project, 16 is going to be fine. You can also see I have a second layer of edges for the water, and this is for a tile set animation. If you look closely, you can tell that the edges of these ripples here are different than the parallel ones over here. So I'm going to be showing you just how to do like a basic animation with a tile set, which is a cool system built into GameMaker, which is really nice. And I'm just doing a 2-frame animation, so each edge piece will basically just move back and forth a little bit. It probably won't look awesome, but it'll look a-okay. So yeah, that's the water. We've done the same thing for the ground, where we have the 9 ground pieces that sort of do the edges, and then the other 6 pieces that have the rounded out corners. Or maybe I should just say like the heel of the corners or something like that. But done the same thing with the regular ground, except I also have some walls here, which are going to be important for gameplay purposes. I have a little dirt path, which doesn't really need these rounded corners because of the way the tile set works, just because of the simplicity of the 2 tones and the size of it. This centerpiece can just be used in place of pretty much any of these, so that's fine. And then I did a last one, which is a second version of the ground, except this one's darker, which I'm not really sold on the looks, but mostly it's just to have like an upper layer for certain sections of ground, so it's just very readable for the player to know that, okay, this is inaccessible ground. This is a raised section. So cool, pretty simple. Feel free to pause and copy if you want to. Here's the top part. Here's the bottom part. One thing to note is the reason that I'm not using this really space for anything. Well, I'm using it as like a palette kind of, but I believe they do this because it helps GameMaker have an easier time compiling the tiles in the tile sets. And I believe it also helps the tile-based collision system that GameMaker Studio 2 has, which we may go over at some point one day, who knows? I believe it makes sense for their software to sort of cut out the 0 position tile. So this tile is never going to be used. You'll see whenever we turn this into a tile set that the tile set itself ignores this space. And so whether or not you do anything in this, it doesn't matter. That's why I generally like to do stuff like putting like color palettes up here or something like that. But anyways, that's that. Remember, you also get this tile set if you go on my Patreon and you support at one of the higher tiers. There's a tier that gets you the whole project file as a download, and so that includes this tile set and everything. Oh, and one last thing is just this little patch of dirt that I can just sort of place anywhere and it looks fine. Just for a little bit of visual fun, along with a little bit of flair up here. So anyways, now that we have our sprite ready, let's actually make our tile set. So right click over here, I'm gonna go to create and then down to tile set. And the first thing that we're gonna do is just pick our sprite, which is the most important part. So there we go. I picked my sprite. You can see the GameMaker is ignoring this top left corner. It's not outlined, so that's where that is. Over here on the right, you're probably not going to need to change anything at all. The main thing you would want to alter if you needed to would be the tile width and height. You're probably doing it like I did, which was 16 by 16 pixels, but this is where you would change that value. So if I made it 32 by 32, you can see it made these much bigger tiles. So yeah, but I generally stick to 16 by 16. So all this should be totally fine. Don't really need to know anything about this stuff right now. And now we just got to name it. So I named my sprite S Tiles Outside. So I'm just going to name this Tiles Outside. So cool. Now it's technically done. Now we could make a tile layer, assign this asset to it, and place down tiles however we want. But we can go ahead and make a couple things nicer for ourselves. So first, let's do those tile animations I was talking about. So click on the tile animation tab. You can see that you got your frame rate up here. That's because all of the tile-based animations are going to have to share a frame rate. I assume that's just because it's a lot more lightweight and much easier for GameMaker to just swap out all tiles at once instead of having any weird like syncopation with the different frame rates. So that's probably why they do it. But since we only have one type of animation, which is the water, that's going to be totally fine with us. So I'm going to set the frame rate pretty low because it's only going to be a 2-frame animation. So I'm going to set it to like 4 frames per second, something like that. I don't know. Remember, you change it however you want to. But let's add our animations. So click on add animation. We get a new little animation right here. We can choose the number of frames. You'll see that they're all a power of 2. So 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. That's just how it works. It's probably to avoid any weird issues, and it probably makes it a lot easier on GameMaker to work with powers of 2 like this. But again, that's fine. So these are only going to be 2-frame animations. You see we get our 2 little sub images here, and now we just have to select them. So I'm going to always select the one on the left first, and then the equal tile on the right. And so now we technically have a little animation, and let me zoom in really far to show you. So it's running at 4 frames a second, and you can hit the play button and it shows it. Like I said, it looks pretty simple, but a little bit better than just having static water in the room. So cool. So now we can just add the rest of the animations in the same way for the edge pieces. Okay, cool. So now we have all 8 of our edge water pieces, and they animate, which is nice. So anytime we put one of these 8 tiles down in the room editor, when we preview the room editor or when we run the game, these will animate, which is really cool. If I wanted to, I also could have done a second set for these, but I figured the way the water kind of goes around the corners here, it looks fine if it doesn't move. Again, change it however you want to. So that's the basics of how you do tile animation. So I'm going to close that. And then the last thing I'm going to show you is the auto tiling system. So let's open that up. And this is just going to make our lives a little bit easier in the room editor, being able to draw out some patterns really simply without having to manually put in every single edge or corner can save some time and a little bit of headache. So yeah, let's do it. So much like the animations, you can make multiple sets of auto tiling. And technically we have 1, 2, 3, 4 things that we could set to be auto tiling. But I'm just going to do the ground here, the regular ground, and I'll explain why once we've done it. And I show this off in the room editor. So like I said, auto tiling can be great, but it can kind of have some drawbacks / limitations, but it's going to work great for our ground. So you can see up here, like I mentioned before, there's a 16 tile version and a 47 tile version. The 47 tile version would be super dynamic. You could place single squares, you could place just single 1 unit long lines, make crazy shapes, all that. And the 16 tile size is better for if you want to cover larger areas that aren't super intricate with your tiles. And so that's why the ground works, because we want to just have big patches of ground for the player to run around on and the enemies to run around on. So let's add our 16 size tile set. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and you can see here, it kind of gives you a little outline for what type of pieces you should be putting. It is confusing. I'm not a massive fan of the sort of graphic that they've chosen to do this. I think this can be kind of hard to read, so I'll explain what it is, and hopefully you'll click into it pretty fast. If you go into the Yo-Yo Games documentation for GameMaker Studio 2 online, and you open up auto tiling, or you just search on Google auto tiling GMS2, that will come up. You can open that, and that has some actual reference images with like a mock-up tile set. I think that one's a lot more clear. even though I kind of wish the images that they chose for the 16 tile set were a little bit more readable. But the system works. It's just kind of hard to understand what this is supposed to be. So what this is the light side of it, in this instance, let's say, would represent the ground. So the positive space. And the dark gray part represents the negative space. Or in the case of the ground, the negative space is just the air. So for example, the first piece, which is the solid white, is just the middle piece for the ground. And so this piece here, where you have the little dark gray piece in the middle, that means that the negative space needs to be there. And so for us, that would be this piece, right? Because here's the little negative space and here's the white. And this also works for me pretty well because I chose a very light color for the ground and the grass, and I chose a very dark color for the wall, so it does match up pretty well in this instance. And so here you'd see I would pick this shape right here, and something to kind of help us along is you can show the guides even after you've already placed the pieces. So if I were to click this button here, you can now see that they sort of highlight with what it was, and so that can kind of help continuously guide you through. So obviously this one would be the opposite, so this piece right here. Now I think these pieces are the reason it's a little confusing, having it be half and half like this, or I think maybe the white part should have been pushed up a little bit to show that the black part is the edge. But the black or the darker part is the edge, and again the white is the ground, so this piece is technically this piece right here. So seeing it with the overlay, you can kind of think of the dark gray part as outlining the edge. So again, this is another one of those corners down here, bottom left. This is the edge being on the left side, like that. These, once again, are a little confusing because of the way they sort of connect. But again, we just have to remember that the lighter space is where the ground needs to go, and the dark space is where the edges are. So technically, that's this piece right here. So the top left is ground, bottom right is ground, top right is edge, and bottom left is edge. So that's technically, oops, my bad. So that's technically this piece. And you can see it kind of here. It makes sense, but honestly, I probably would have done the opposite, where I probably would have made this piece look like the inverse of this piece. So have a white big space going top left to bottom right, and then two dark circles. I could just be thinking kind of closed-mindedly because this is how I make tile sets, and maybe some people do it differently. Maybe some people do it where they have the edges of tile sets be in the center of the tiles, but I want to say most people probably do it similarly to how I'm doing it right now. At the very least, an option to switch between the two would be nice, but like I said, regardless, once you understand it, it works. And I'll admit, it's also a little challenging for me as well because I don't use the auto tiling system too much. More on that later. But anyways, we have this piece now, which is an edge on the left and an edge on the top, and ground on the bottom right, which would be this piece right here. And then we have, I believe, the final piece of the little rounded corners like this right here. This piece is the opposite of this one, where the ground is in the top right and the bottom left. So that piece. This is the edges on the right. This is the edges on the top and on the right. So this one, edge on the bottom, that piece right there, edge on the left and bottom, edge on the right and bottom, and then just negative space. So you can just select nothing or just, this empty tile up here on the top left. And this also just has to do with how I make tile sets as well. But generally, this last tile space would be blank for me. I don't really know how it calculates negative space when you haven't put something there. But again, that could just be the way I make stuff. But so yeah, it looks like this. If you just want to copy my reference image, if you're following along with this, that's it with the guide overlays. But yeah, so we have it. So it's done, which is cool. And one more thing I'll mention is this little button here, open or closed edges. This basically just has to do with the edge of the room. So whenever our tiles run to the edge of the room, do we want to pretend like there are some tiles outside of the room, so the tiles continue going off screen, which would be good for like a path or something like that, in which case you would want to turn this off like that, I'm pretty sure. We'll see if I'm right, which one way or the other. And I believe the default is this, which is the closed edges, which means that if I were to put tiles up against the edge of the room, they won't continue like they're going off screen. The edge will just be at the end of the room. So anyways, this has to be right or your auto tiling is going to look weird. So just check on that first. And now we're ready to pretty up our room. So this is done. I'm going to close it. I'm going to go into my room, and I'm going to add a tile layer, and I'll just call this ground level or something like that. Cool. And I want to put it below my instances because I want my tiles to show up under all this stuff. We don't want them to cover up our player and all that. So let's go into our tile layer, click on it, and then we can come to our layer properties and select a tile set. So open that up. Let's select our one tile set that we have. And over here, we have the little room editor for it. So like I said before, now we can just grab any tile and just start painting it around like this, all willy-nilly if we want. There's a toolbar up here, which is really nice. So there's like a, it works basically just like, how any pixel art does. There's a pencil tool or a pen tool to write with. There's an eraser tool. There's a fill tool, which just obviously fills like a closed space with whatever tile you have highlighted. So line tool, which is cool, draw lines with stuff. So again, like do that. And fill tool, it fills on either side. Square tool, obviously. Select tool, so you can grab any set of already painted tiles and move them around. So for example, if I were to go to my pen, but I were to select like a bunch of different tiles, you can paint with this whole section that you want. So if I were to do this, and now I were to go to select tiles, I could do this, Control X to cut it out, and then now I can just move this piece around, all that kind of stuff. And you can go to auto tiles up here, and now I have my auto tile brush. Since we only have one, it just defaulted to that one, but if you have multiple kind of auto tile things going on, you can go over here to the libraries tab and select which auto tile you want to use. Then you can click on it. It should set this to auto tile for you already, and then you can use whichever one you have. So here's what this looks like, which is cool. See, I can just paint around, and it's filling in all this stuff for me, which cuts down on a lot of time. So I'm, just gonna make this like a sort of big open area. Cool, easy. Look how fast that was. And if I were to right click with this, then we would start deleting certain squares like this, which is cool. And remember, you still have to be in auto tiling mode if you want to right click and get rid of tiles like this. Because if I were to switch to like say my pen tool and right click to delete, or if I were to switch to my eraser to delete, it just straight up deletes the tiles. So it doesn't keep the auto tiling factor in. Really quick, I'm going to hide the instance layer because it's getting pretty noisy. But yeah, so that's how you do that. And you may have noticed that when unpainting these tiles, it's a single pixel long. Oh, okay, and yeah, it looks like I did actually have the edge thing backwards. But yeah, like I was saying, so if we right click and we're deleting, we can delete a single square at a time. But when we're painting, it's this big 3x3 block like this. So like, why can't I paint one at a time? Well, that's what I was saying. That's the big difference between a 16 size tile set and a 47. You can see we don't have singular width tiles here and any support tiles to go with those. So that's why it adds so many different tiles to do that. And you can see here, if I'm holding the right key and I'm deleting stuff and I go this way, that's all fine. But if I were to start going up, it would delete both of these because I don't have one that fits in this singular column. Again, it's basically just taking care of us and just saying like, okay, we're not gonna let you ruin your own auto tiling. And so that's why when painting it first, it has to default at this 3x3. Now, I could be wrong of this, but just thinking off the top of my head, I'm pretty positive they technically could go smaller by one space. I'm pretty sure they could do a 2x2 square, which should, in theory, have the exact same effect. Maybe they did the 3x3 so that way you could have a centered piece, so you wouldn't be like offset. But I mean, I can't imagine dragging it around like this would be too difficult for people to get a hang of. But anyways, yeah. So this is the auto tiling. So it's not too bad, but that's the 3x3, and the other method of auto tiling just requires you to make a ton of tiles. But the auto tiling system is good, and it can help you out a lot, especially in terms of saving time. So that's why I wanted to show it to you. And so, yeah. And that, by the way, is the same reason I don't really feel like doing the auto tiling for the path in the ground or the water or this top layer, because they're all probably going to be relatively thin spaces. So I'd have to be auto tiling and then editing over it anyways, which would kind of conflict with the other stuff unless I wanted to make a bunch of tile layers. So whatever, you can try it out if you want to, that's totally fine. But yeah, so now we can make cool tiles on the ground. Stuff obviously doesn't have to auto tile, so once you're done with all that, you can come in with like details, like I'm gonna put little spurts of grass everywhere, Just making sure I'm not going over any of my auto-tiled stuff. Maybe some mushrooms over here and there. Some little flowers. Nice stuff like that. If I wanted to make a path, I might just like trace it out with the center block and then sort of come back over with all these like edge pieces and stuff like that. And yeah, you can see that one's a little bit slower. So again, the auto tiling's good whenever you can use it and you know it's going to be nice and efficient. So I can do that. I can grab a couple chunks of water if I want to. Maybe I want like a little thinner part of water up here. So that's cool. And then I can hit the play button in the top right here, which will preview any animations in the room, including our instances. So hit that. Oh, and you see, I was being a little hasty and I must have made an error here. So one of my animations is wrong. So I'm going to pause that and go back into my tile animations. And yep, there it is. I just clicked wrong on this animation here. So I'm going to highlight that frame and select the correct thing. There we go. I might need to restart the room. So let me try and test it again. Okay, no, I didn't need to restart the room, but sometimes whenever changing images and stuff like that, closing the room and opening it back up will show the new changes that you made. But yeah, cool. So the water animates. That's awesome. Our tile sets are pretty much done, which I actually messed up that bottom one there. So yeah, that's how you use the tile sets. I'm going to make some more changes because another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the room bigger because now we want to have a camera that follows the player around. And having tile sets will make that easier to visually see the player scrolling around. So I'm going to change the size of the room. But before I do that, I'm going to show you something. Because I'm going to change the size of the room to be pretty big. And I'll explain why. So I'm going to get rid of just pretty much everything that isn't the player. Oh yeah, look at that. I forgot we added the shadows to these. Cool. Yeah, I'm getting everything out of here except the player just so I can move around. I'm not going to add any walls back in yet because like I said, I'm about to change all this. But let's run the game and talk about something. Okay, we got our game. Player moves around. We aim with the mouse. We shoot. We know this. We just spent a very long time doing this. But let's talk about the difference between keyboard and mouse and controller. Like I said, we're going to cover controller probably in like a bonus video at the end of this series. But something you may have noticed while testing this game already, or maybe something that hasn't bothered you yet but could potentially in the future, is the difference between using a keyboard and mouse and a controller for this type of game, like a top-down shooter where you have to manually aim. So the camera doesn't move, so we're totally static. And we've noticed that our player obviously always points towards the mouse. However, because the camera is static and the player changes positions on the screen a bunch, you can see that if I were to want to run to the left while shooting straight down like this, if I were to just run to the left, the angle changes. So nothing wrong with that. It makes sense. That's what we want. We want to aim towards the mouse. However, it can get a little tiring to just constantly follow your player with the mouse instead of basically just using the mouse in the center here. Like, imagine if the player always stayed in the center of the screen pretty much and we just had to aim like this. You know, it's a lot faster, it's a little bit less cumbersome, and it doesn't mean that we'll have to adjust ourselves constantly. It's not too bad considering most of the time you're probably just going to be wanting to pointing, like if I wanted to shoot these mushrooms, I'm probably just going to be pointing at them the entire time anyways. But whenever you have a lot of enemies on screen and you might want to be doing crazy stuff like this, shooting a bunch out at once, or you're just kind of generally aiming towards a bunch of enemies, I think it's nice to be able to keep a lot of your control in the center of the screen. So we're going to make a camera where the player stays in the center of the screen. Not very revolutionary. That's pretty much how every video game works. But what I'm saying is we also don't want the camera to run into the edge of the screen like this, where all of a sudden the camera stops moving and the player now moves independently of the screen, which means that the player is going to have to start compensating with their mouse. So there's two ways to achieve this. One, whenever we make our camera object, we can explicitly tell our camera to not stop at the edge of the room. That is something that you can do in GameMaker. The default camera system stays within the boundaries of the room, which is good, but if you know what you're doing, you can tell it to not do that. So that's one way to do it, and that way the camera will always make sure that the player is in the center of the screen, and that can work totally fine. But what if, per se, our background is just like a tile layer or something like that? You can't place tiles outside of the room. Not like you could with an object. Like you could put an object out here, but if I go to my tile layer, I can't draw outside of the room. So if we want to have stuff like tile layers for our background, which is what we are going to do, I'm just going to use this purple color and some of these as a layer in the background under this layer. If we want to do that, then we need to make our room big enough to where it has enough space for our camera to never really get caught on the edge, at least as far as our gameplay space is concerned. Or, you know, making most of our gameplay space to where the player never gets too far from the center of the screen. Because having the camera actually run into the edge of the room can be beneficial too, especially for stuff like room transitions, if you want it to just be they walk off screen to the right, and then on the next screen they walk in from the left. So yeah, anyways, that's why the room is going to be really, really big. And so now I'm just going to make it bigger real quick. So I'm going to make this 1920 by 1080, which just happens to be the resolution for 1080p, but it was just a clean multiple of our camera size, so that's why I did it. So really quick, I'm just going to get rid of my background layer. I can't really see the size of the room anymore, so I'm going to create another tile layer, drag it to the bottom, and I'll call this background tiles. I'm going to use my same tile set, and I'm going to fill in the background with this dark purple that I had. And then I'm going to fill in a bunch of it with these this like little grass tile that I have, and then I'm just going to copy and paste that a bunch. Okay, so yeah, I have that background, and then I'm just going to copy that and paste it around, so I have a pretty decently random looking background of forest or whatever this location is. Okay, got my new background, and it's a separate layer, so I can turn it on and off if I want to, which means I could, like, you know, select this whole ground layer and copy it and move it over here, and then delete it with a right click. You know how to do this stuff now, so I'm just going to create the level that I want to really quick, and I'll show you how much space it actually takes up on the screen in the room. Okay, so here I've got my little basic level. As you can see, there's a lot of kind of negative space around the corners. And basically what I've done is I've just kind of eyeballed this. You can be a little bit more precise with it if you want to, but remember, the player's always going to be in the middle of the view. So no matter where this view is in the room, it's scooting around, the player should always be in the middle of it, right? Which basically just means that if we have negative space to the left of the halfway point of this on the level, we only have about half here worth of this, half here worth of this, and then half here worth of that, then we're good. You can see the room is actually a little big. I could definitely, for this level, I could definitely make it a little bit smaller, but I'm not being super precise. So I just added a sprite layer here. You don't have to do this. I'm just showing you a better visual for it. So imagine, you know, the player's moving around and this is where the screen is following. Farthest left I can go on this screen will mean that the camera's here. So again, I could make it shorter, but this means that if we go as far left as possible, then the camera won't catch on the sides of the room. Same with, you know, about up here is where the play area is going to kind of stop. And this is, like I was mentioning, like a level transition. So if the player's walking, the camera will stop here and the player can keep going up so they can go off screen. Same at the bottom. This is about the farthest down the player can get. We've still got room. And over here, we still got room. I've talked a couple times in this series about efficiency and, you know, trying to do some smart code and stuff like that. And anytime you can kind of squeeze in a little optimization easily, it's not a bad idea. Having rooms that are like this much bigger than they need to be isn't really optimal. Like I said, probably what you would want to do is just unbound the camera from the room parameters, and then you would need some other object that could draw a background for you, so that way once your camera panned over, you know, if your camera was like hanging over the edge of the room like this, it wouldn't just be a void slash the game wouldn't be copying each frame in the weird way that games do. So you'd need some code slash room objects to stop that. You'd probably also want some code to tell the game, okay, I do, when I'm going up this way, actually want to stop the camera here. So it would basically just add a bunch of different work that for a little game like this, just a simple top-down shooter, I think it's fine to just go for the bigger rooms and give yourself, you know, the space. And again, if you decide that you don't really care about doing the space anyways, and you're fine with the camera, you know, bumping up against the edge of the room, then you can do it that way too. It's totally fine. So like I said, I did all this on just the single ground level layer. I did some auto tiling whenever I made these walls up here. I didn't do any because there weren't any problems, so I could just do them, and I just used these wall parts right here like this, and then I would just, you know, fill in the right area, and so now we have an elevated wall, all that good stuff. Now, before we do anything else with the tiles, again, like adding a new layer for other stuff, let's just get the camera following the player, and we're going to do it slightly different than we did in the RPG series. As you may or may not know, down here where we defined our viewports and the size of our camera and all that stuff, here in the room properties under room settings, viewports and cameras, we set all this, and there is also a bit to tell GameMaker, okay, here is what object do we want the camera to follow, and there's just a little bit of information regarding the built-in
camera following system. We used that in the RPG series because it was totally acceptable to use it there, and in a lot of cases, it can be a really easy way to get stuff working for your game. But whenever we get to the polish section of this game, I want to show you how to do like camera shake and stuff like that. And I also just want to show you how to sort of unbound the camera from the room, in case you were wondering. And to do both of those, we need our own camera object that we need to make. So let's do a couple things. I'm gonna clear out my workspace really quick. And the first thing we're gonna do is create a camera object. So I'm gonna right click, create, go to object. I'm just gonna call this O camera, easy peasy. And we wanna come over here before we do anything. So we already talked about visible. It just turns on and off a draw event for an object, but here we have persistent. Gone over this in pretty much every video I think I've made. We've had to make a persistent object. And basically what it means is exactly what it says. Instances of this object will persist between rooms. Basically just means that if this object has been created in your game, it will transition to new rooms as the game does. So it hangs out forever. Let's go ahead and check this on. This is the ideal setting to use for stuff like a camera or like an object that manages all of your settings, like music volume. I've made like an item inventory manager in one video, a sound effect manager. I've even done things like settings where you would want to reference certain stuff. So yeah, that's how you'd want to do that. So at first, this is going to be super simple. We don't even need a create event. We don't need any object specific variables for this camera. So easy enough. Let's just add an event. We're going to go and add an end step event, not a regular step event, an end step event. There's a begin step, a regular step, and an end step event. And basically it's just 3 separate step events, but the game runs them in that order. So every single object's begin step event will run first, then every single object's step event will run, and then every single object's end step event will run. And so the end step event is where you'd want to do stuff where you immediately want all the information that's happened in the last game frame, such as the player's X and Y coordinate. Because the player moves their X and Y coordinate in the normal step event, we want to get their coordinates after that, but also on the same frame that the game is rendering. So that's why we would want to use the end step event. So first, I'm going to make that big again. And let's just say we want to center on the player. So first we want to check for the player actually existing. So let's say, so if instance exists of player, just to make sure we're not checking for values that we can't find, so we avoid any crashes. And we want to set the camera's X and Y position to the player's X and Y. So X equals O player.X and Y equals O player.Y. And even better, if we really want to center the camera, like really want to center it, we already have a variable called center Y for the player that we use to calculate our aiming direction. So now the camera's X and Y coordinate are dead on the center of the player, or at least from the position where the player aims, which is what we would probably want to be in the middle of the screen anyways. And then we can set the camera position. And we can use a simple built-in function called camera set view pause, like this. So camera set view position. So what that stands for, we have to tell it what camera we want to set the position of, and then we have to give it an X and a Y. Simple enough. So because we are going to just be using the built-in cameras, but we're just going to be controlling it with our own code, we already activated one. We already activated down here in viewports and cameras. We already activated viewport and camera 0, which is just the first one in GameMaker. So because there's multiple viewports and view cameras, they're stored in an array inside of GameMaker, and that array is called view camera. So we're getting the first view camera, which is like that, just like how any other array would work. So cool, that's the camera we're using, and we want to set it to our X and Y position. Now this isn't perfect. You'll see why I'm about to show you, but in order to show you, we actually have to make sure our camera is in the game. So we got to place it somewhere. We could place object camera directly in our room, but instead of doing that, we're going to do the thing that I do in pretty much all my videos, and I'm going to create a new room that is for initializing all the important stuff in the game. So I'm going to right click over here and create room, and I'm going to call this RM initialize. Cool. Now I have this blank room. Again, my default values are kind of crazy, so they're pretty high. This room doesn't need to be big at all. I'm just gonna set it back to the size that I want my camera to be, which is 640 by 360. And there are a few things we need to do. Again, if you've watched any of my videos before, you kind of know how this works already. But the first thing we want to go ahead and do is go into our room order up here. So not our room folder, but our room order under quick access. We can put our rooms down here in any order that we want, and it won't change anything in the game. However, room order does actually change the order of the rooms in the game and the ID of each one, kind of. So right now, room 1 is room 0, room initialize is room 1, and then any more would be room 2, room 3, room 4, room 5. So, and it marks it that the top one here has a little house on it. And that little house means that it's the room that the game is going to start with. So let's drag our room initialize up to the top because we want this to be the first thing that runs. Okay, good. Now, because room initialize is running first before room 1, we need to set our viewports and cameras in here as well, because all the initial settings for the camera are set based on the first room in the game. You could also set them in code, but we already know how to do this, so let's just do it here. And once we've done it in the initialization room, we don't have to change it anywhere else. So let's just redo what we did in that first room. If you had different things than I did, then you might need to check and cross-reference. Remember, first you have to enable your viewport, open up viewport 0, and make it visible. So that's the first thing. Remember, you need this white border to show up. And then for me, I made it 640 wide by 360, and this is why I made the room the same size, just so I could confirm that I got all this right. And then my viewport properties. Originally, I had 1280 by 720 because that was double the size. That's a pretty good size for the window of the game. So you might want to keep it that way, but I just brought it up to 1920 by 1080, so it'd be easier for you to see, so it takes up pretty much the whole screen. But if your game is working fine before this, just check back in your room 1 and then make sure all these details are the same. The viewport is enabled, it's visible, and then all your camera properties are identical to how they were in room 1, and they're over here. Okay, cool. So we've got the setup back out of the way. Now we just need to get to the next room. So like I said, normally what happens in GameMaker is the first room is the one that you start in immediately. And we're going to set it up the same way to where the next room is the one we start in. So we're going to start this. It's going to create all these objects and things we need. And then we're going to immediately hop to the second room in this order. So it still kind of works the same way. So in order to do that, we can go back into this room properties things above where the viewports and cameras were. And then we can go into creation code. So just like creation code for objects in the create events, this code will run on the frame that the game is created, which means we can just immediately tell the game to go to the next room with this simple function called room go to next. And that basically just means at the creation of this room, all the objects in it will be created that we put in here, and then it will immediately hop to room 1 or whatever room is directly under. So before we check any of the camera stuff, I'm just going to move my player into the view since it won't move right now. And I'm just going to run the game to check and make sure this works. So basically, we shouldn't even see this black screen at all. And we should immediately be pushed into this next room, which means make sure that your player, honestly, maybe even put your player to like the top left or something. Just make sure that they're in the view right now. You don't want them to be way out here because you won't be able to see them anyways. But if we run the game, okay, so we can see that it's not visually any different. The camera's right. It's not squished up or anything like that. If you don't get the camera settings correct, GameMaker will probably try and compress the entire room into your window, which is why it would look really squishy and stretched. So again, just make sure that you're setting up your camera again properly in the initialization room. If your screen is black, then that means you either didn't put in the room go to next code or you put it in the wrong place. So remember that in your initialization room, go into room properties, creation code, room go to next. That should be good. And the camera won't be following the player because we haven't put in our camera object yet. So I'm going to move my player outside of the original camera range now. I'm going to go into my initialization room. I'm going to go into my instance layer so I can put down some objects. And I'm going to put down the camera object. Just one single instance of it. The reason it's a question mark is just because it doesn't have a sprite assigned to it, but this will be exactly the same as, how you would add any other object. Just highlight it and hold Alt and then add it in. Remember that your camera has to be set to persistent over here. And if you had the code exactly the same, then this is what it should look like. Okay. And now where's the player, you may ask? Well, the player is up here on the top left. And that's because we're setting the camera coordinates to the player's center. And so now we kind of see how the camera works. The camera's coordinates are not the middle here. They're actually just the top left of the view. So the good news is it's following the player where we tell it to. Now we just need to get like an offset of the screen. We need to know half of the width of the screen and half of the height, and we need to go that way up left more with it, and we need to offset the player's position by that. So that's pretty easy. Let's get out of here and go back into our camera object. Again, if the camera was not following the top left of the player and it wasn't moving around while you were moving around, then again, make sure this code is working here. Make sure you're setting the correct view camera and that it's persistent, all that stuff. And so now we need to alter the X and Y just a little bit. And what we're going to do is first, we're going to get the camera's width and height so we can get half of them, right? So first, let's set up var. I'm going to call this underscore cam W, and that's going to be our camera's width. And like most things like this, we have a very simple built-in function to do this. So we can say camera get view width. And then we just have to input what camera we're looking for. And we are checking our view camera 0. Same one. And so we can get the height with the exact same thing pretty much. So camera get view height. That's also going to be view camera 0. And so now that we know how wide in pixels the camera is and how tall it is in pixels, we can subtract half of those from each of these values. So for our X, which is our left and right axis, we obviously want to subtract half of our camera's width. So just minus camera W divided by 2. And then over here, we can just subtract our cam height divided by 2. And so the camera was, to the bottom right of the player. That'll move the camera to the left half of its own size, and it will move the camera up half of its own size. So this should get our player in the correct position. So let's run the game again, and look at that, working great. And now, and you may have noticed this already, naturally, our camera is no longer bound by the game. So we're getting this weird stuff out here in the void. And basically what the void is doing is it's taking any draw events that it's seeing, and it's just drawing them, but not clearing them out. So this is the edge of the room. It'll basically do this. There's a setting to turn this off, but really the thing is, for the way we've set this up, we really just don't want to see the edge of this at all. We want the camera to collide with the edge, but it's fun. This is how you would do it if you just wanted to make the room smaller but have no edge collision with the camera. And again, you would just have to have some object that would be drawing your background for you based on the camera's position, because then it would draw no matter where you were. But since we're not doing that, we're going to add that code back in. And so I'm going to add this code here and call it clamp cam position to room borders. So let's do that real quick. Again, our X and Y position is actually the top left of the camera. So this should be pretty easy. So since it's the top left of the camera, for our X position, we want to use clamp again. We've already used this before. We input a value. So we're inputting our X value, and then we're setting what is the absolute minimum it can go to. And for that, it would just be 0, because it would just be the left side of the screen. And now we want the maximum value. So how far right can we go? Well, we can use the built-in room width. So GameMaker already knows how wide the room is. So that is the far right border is going to be the room width. But remember, our camera's position is on the left side of the camera, the top left. And we want it to where the right side of the camera can't go past our room width. So what kind of math could we do to figure that out? Pretty easy. We want to make sure that the left side of our camera doesn't go past our room width minus the width of the camera as well. And if we were to visualize it, again, this is the camera's X and Y position. So if I'm going left, I can't go less than 0, so it'll snap me back over here. But if I were to just set it to room width for the maximum value it could go to, we could actually go all the way over here, because this is when the camera would equal the room width. So that's why we're subtracting the width of the view as well. So really, we're not clamping over here. We're actually just clamping over here on this line, but visually it looks exactly the same. And so we're going to do the same with the X and Y as well. And it works the same way. 0 is up here, so the minimum is going to have to be 0. And going down, we want this value right here to be the maximum. And that's going to be, you guessed it, the room height minus the camera height. So let's do that real quick. So Y equals clamp Y 0 minimum room height minus the camera height maximum. Cool. So this should give us our borders now, because we're setting the X and Y based on the player here, but before we're actually changing anything with the X and Y values, we're clamping them. So let's test it out. Working fine. If I go to the top left, yep, there it is. Now I'm just going to test the bottom right. So there's the bottom and there's the right. Cool, perfect. And like I said, as you can see, we have this little bit of dead zone here where this is as far down as the player can go. So the camera only gets caught once the player goes over here. So as far as the playing field goes, the camera is always going to stay centered on the player. So the player never has to move the mouse much more from the middle of the screen. Again, I think that's just a little bit nicer in terms of gameplay, but it's obviously your decision. So cool. Now we can make rooms as big as we want pretty much. We have a camera that follows us, and we have our initialization room for anything else we might need to do that stuff with, any other persistent objects. So cool. Okay, if none of this matches up, maybe put in a title card that says, "Intermission, I had to eat a sandwich," or something stupid like that. Because it's true, I just had a bologna and cheese sandwich. You should remember, wasn't that long ago. Your mind is deteriorating, old man. Okay, camera working, tiles working. Let's do one more thing with the tiles. I'm going to add some walls back in, and then we're going to do one more thing with the tiles, which is the sort of elevated ground tiles that you can walk behind, like you see in this example right here. I'm going to be doing this in the most simplistic way I can inside a GameMaker, so hopefully you like it. Anyways, walls back in. So I like to make a separate instance layer for my walls and call it walls, like that, so that way I can turn them on and off whenever I have them sitting everywhere. So first, let's add some of these, and first let's do our yellow walls. If you remember, our red walls are the solid ones, so that would be like the actual ground, stuff like this that the bullets can run into, but the yellow ones the bullets can go over, so it's kind of like an invisible air wall. So I'm just gonna put those everywhere they would need to be. Can just do one big one for this, that couple of these, drag that down. Oh, remember you're outlining the actual ground here. You're not outlining bottom part like that. Just makes a bit of a difference there. Do some of this. Okay, and we need the holes in the ground over here as well. So let's get these all filled out. And the water also works the same way as the holes. It's just a visual difference for variety, at least for our game right now. So cool, now let's add in some red walls. So highlighting my object solid wall, and then I'm just gonna trace around the base of this. I can pull that one out and just do that one like that. Easy. Oh, and I could also pull this one up, like about here. Oh, I forgot to do the walls, the yellow walls for up here. Okay, we'll come back and do that. Just gonna kind of fill this out, whatever, and do it like that. Make sure there are no holes. So I'm gonna add in these air walls over here, and I put them kind of behind these walls because, you know, they're sort of like 3D. They're elevated up or whatever. So cool. Let's just test that real quick. We already know it works, but it's fun to play video games. Look at that, working over there and then flying over where it needs to. Cool. Player can't walk out. Nice. Can't get in that little space, but whatever. Didn't want to go in there anyways. Okay, cool. And as I just kind of showed off, it depends on the size of your player, how you do collision masks. And like I said, we're not using precise collisions. So it's best just from a level design perspective to just kind of avoid spaces that are like the exact same size as the player. So for this game, I would pretty much keep all paths. This is 4 tiles wide. That's 3 tiles wide. And you could even really easily get away with 2 tiles wide. So cool. And so now let's talk about top layers that we can walk behind again. So you see here, if I were to, turn off the visibility of the wall layer. So now they're all here. They're just turned off, just like in the room editor they are. And we can see here my bullets and stuff go over the top of this sort of incline, right? And we want them to show up behind. And if the player walks behind them, we want the player to show up behind it as well. So real quick, I'm going to exit and I'm going to make a tile layer. I'm going to call it ground level 2. Put it above the ground level so it shows up on top in the room editor. And then I'm going to select my tile set over here or over here. Doesn't matter. Use this. And like I said, I'm just going to use this to show off a little bit of elevation here. So I'm going to make like a top like this. And so this part is going to draw like on top of the player. So if I were to scoot this over and put the player under here, this part will kind of draw on top of the player like that. So the player can walk behind it or whatever. And then on my regular ground level, I'm going to add in walls here. And so you can see if the player were to run into this and run around, the player would show up behind it, but would show up in front of this because it's working this way. This isn't the only method to sort of achieve this. Now, it's working right now in the room editor, but remember, we're setting our player's depth dynamically. So that means we need to go ahead and change the depth of this tile layer to be a value that will work with that. So before I do anything, I'm just going to add the walls in. And you can kind of cheat in top-down games like this. You don't really need it to be completely spatially accurate. So, and for the sake of the visuals working a little bit better, I'm going to have the top of it be here. Because I also just don't want the player to be able to be covered up, because then you have to get into stuff like silhouetting the player behind things for clarity's sake and enemies, and that's kind of just a whole other thing. To be honest, it's actually something that I haven't really messed with a lot myself, so probably have some good use of shaders and masking effects and stuff like that. Things I'm not well read up on enough to include in this series, and I think it would probably also just be a little too complicated anyways. So we're just going to do it this way where, in this scenario, if the player were to walk up to the top of this, you can still see the player's head poking out a little bit, and same with the enemies. So that's going to be my kind of rule of thumb, is just have one single space and the rest of it be solid. So if I were to run the game now, the player would end up actually showing up on top of this like this, because the player is setting their depth to basically their negative y coordinate. I think we did a bounding box bottom instead of the y coordinate exactly, but same thing pretty much. So if the player was down here, for example, we can look down here at the y position of our player that we have highlighted, and that's 510. So our player's depth would be at about negative 510. And for our ground level to show up above our player like this, this ground level, this tile layer's depth would have to be lower than negative 510, so like negative 1,000 or something like that. And I'm pretty much just going to use this tile layer to be the top layer of every elevated ground in this level that I were to add in. So basically, we know that the player is always going to be on screen. So in our room here, which is 1080 pixels tall, the player's depth is never going to go below negative 1080. And in fact, this is actually the lowest point that we can walk on. So the player's depth is actually, you can see down here, player's depth is actually never really going to go below negative 900. So basically, anytime we want to add a layer like this, we just want to make sure that we change the depth here in our layer properties to a number reasonably low that the player is never going to have a lower depth and therefore be drawn on top. So there technically is, I believe, a limit to the values that you can set depth to. I want to say it's from positive 16,000 to negative 16,000. I believe that's it. The point is, you don't need to set it to some insanely low number like negative 1,000,000 or something like that. But for this room, you know, we can never go over 1080. And I'm going to guess for most rooms, you probably won't really go over the 2000 mark in height. So I could just set it to negative 2000. So you may have already kind of tried to mess with it and see that you can't, and that there's a lock here. So default, what GameMaker does is GameMaker just calculates what order you have in the room editor, and that's sort of the natural depth it will draw at. It has like a built-in buffer. So you see right now it's at 200. My instance layer is at 300. Ground level is at 400, 500. Again, the lower the number, the more on top it is drawn. So basically what it does is the top one starts at 0, and then it adds 100 for each layer down. So they draw on top of each other. And if I were to go into my top layer here, which is just actually an empty asset layer that I was using to show off the camera border. So I can even just get rid of this real quick. So anyways, so we'll say top layer is my wall layer, which is now at depth 0. Now this one's at depth 100, 200, 300, and so on. If I were to change my walls, basically what this lock does is this lock sets it to the default values that would be in GameMaker. And as long as the lock is on for a certain layer, pretty much anything below it will also kind of follow suit. So my ground level 2 is 100 and the next one is 200. You see down here, 100 and then 200. If I were to unlock my ground level and change it to, say now we change this to 200, I can highlight it here. Now it's at 200 because it's been unlocked. I've changed it. But now if I go to my instances, now that's 300. Ground level is 400. So anytime you change the depth, it will change anything below it just to make sure that it's all drawing in the right order. That's all well and good normally, but we want to change our ground level top here. We want to change this to a super low number. So if we were to change this to some crazy low number, the automatic 100 depth buffer would kick in and everything else would kind of adjust to that as long as they are locked to the built-in depth like this. And if we were to change it, I'm going to put it right here. I'm going to put it under the instances and walls for organization's sake. But now watch what happens if I were to change this depth to a lower number than the ones above it. So if I were to change this to the negative 2000 we wanted, I change it, it's negative 2000, and now these are also in the negatives. So these are crazy high. And now because the built-in 100 buffer is here, these are crazy high too. So the ground level and the background will be drawing at negative 1800 and negative 1900. So the player would not be visible at all. So really what you need to do is, first I'm going to set this back to what it would naturally be. So I'm going to set this back to 200 and let everything else kind of fix itself out. So yeah, 0, 100, 200, 300, 400. I'm going to unlock the depth for all of the layers. So now the background tile depth is 400. If I were to go into the ground level and I were to change it to 350, it normally would have bumped this up to 450, but now it's just 400. And not only that, but now you can kind of set their depths to be out of order. So even though ground level is above background tiles, I could set this to 500, which should put it below, but here's what's going to happen. Now it's at 500, and now the background is still at 400, so they're all fine. Now, you might have just gotten a little message there, and maybe you've been getting one while you've been doing this, and this is just because I would have turned this message off already in my default settings in GameMaker, and I can't remember what it says, but it says something like, hey, I don't know if you know this, but, you know, we're kind of already organizing the depth, so if you mess with it, we don't really know what might happen. To be honest with you, that sounds a lot scarier than I think it is. I've done this before in projects, and I've used other very radically different methods of sorting layer depth on my own without just using the default built-in GameMaker one, and I haven't really had any issues with that. Like, I can't really think of a circumstance where that caused problems for me. So I can change this back to 300. It doesn't really matter what this is, but the point is I can now make my upper level, you know, this right here, I can now make this -2000, and everything else is exactly where it's supposed to be. Now, if that message does bother you, like I said, that message should be specific to having layer depth that doesn't match the order in the room. So technically, because this is -2000, it should be way up here. It should be like at the very top. If the message worries you, or if you are getting issues, you can go ahead and just put this at the very top. And remember, just make sure that you still unlock all of your layers. So that way this isn't -2000, but then this gets set to -1900, -1800, -1700. You still want these to be positive values. So if doing it out of order makes you nervous, then just feel free to do it this way. I just like to be able to organize everything. You can also do things like creating folders. So like I could create a folder and I could say the tiles go in here, and I could select them and drag them in. I could collapse it. So I like to have everything organized that way. But again, if you're getting issues or it bothers you that there's a message, but you still don't want to turn the message off, then you can just put everything where it's supposed to be. And finally, if you were to add a new layer, so I could create a new instance layer or something, new layers will sort of will tween between the values around it. So this was 0 and this was 100. So this depth went to 50. Because it default starts locked into GameMaker's automatic sorting, which means it says, okay, I need to be in between these two. But if I were to drag this layer directly below our ground level 2 with the -2000, it will set itself to -1900, even though this one's only at 300. So it still does it in the increments of 100, unless of course that doesn't fit. So, you know, it had to make itself 50 here. So you're just gonna have to remember that whenever you make new layers, and especially whenever you make new tile layers, you need to manually mess with the depth and unlock it. So yeah, it's just something you're gonna have to remember to do, but it's important if you wanna have tile layers that have different depths that interact with the player, as long as we're using, you know, this depth system. So before we do any more talking, let's just test it out, make sure all of our depths are right, and they are. So here we go. And what should happen is this. So the player can walk behind, and the player can walk in front. And let me get rid of the walls again real quick. Yep, it's pretty much what we want. Now it's a little quirky. Well, first of all, remember this 20 is not going to be here. We're going to clean this up, but it does do one thing where, you know, the weapon can kind of go under it, which isn't perfect. And you can kind of see where like the bullets come through. If I'm pressed like right against it, you can see them come through a little bit. And that just kind of comes down to, you know, balancing priorities basically. This is a very simple system because now we could do like this. I could very easily add a top layer over here, and I'm going to bring my character down here so I can add like a big layer like this. So very easily just make a big tile thing there, and then go to my regular ground level and add in the actual ground under it. Add the curved bits to make it look a little bit nicer. Cool. And then I can just put my solid walls down. And remember, like I said, we're just doing it in a way where we leave one little row on top, easy peasy, and that's really it. So now it works over here. And as you can see, because I made these 3 tall instead of 2 tall, now you can't see any bullets through it. I'm shooting right now, but you can see you can't see any bullets through it. It works totally fine. Stuff like this I know can be a little bit bothersome for certain people. I am one of those people, by the way. But you kind of got to pick your battles whenever you're making games sometimes. And that's kind of one of the things about these 2D pixel art games that is pretty difficult, is simulating 3D type stuff. Trust me, I'm making an entire game that is basically a 3D game, but with 2D pixel art in GameMaker. So take it from me, there are many challenges that come with it. But like I said, sometimes you just have to pick your battles, and I think this is a very easy solution that makes designing levels and changing up levels very, very easy. This is also how a lot of older games would do top-down RPGs. They would kind of separate the tile sets like this into a top part and a bottom part. So it's not bad. Now that being said, if, say, for instance, you wanted to make a top part that was this is going to look ugly, but a top part that was only one length right here, and adjust my wall like this, this is going to look not good. So if I run right here, I check, yeah, okay, this doesn't look very good. This is one of those things where part of picking your battles is knowing, okay, well, I'm just not going to make any walls that are a single wall thick this way. They're going to be at least 2, and honestly, preferably, they'll probably be 3 tall. Again, the 2 really isn't that big of a deal. It's not that noticeable, and there are some other workarounds too with, you know, you can add a collision check with your weapon to say, if I'm already touching a wall, just don't even fire my bullet, which would solve the bullet problem, stuff like that. There's workarounds for it. As far as this system goes, and it also depends on the size of your character, you're just going to have to kind of work within certain limitations. But another thing you could think of is if we put up my player is quite short. I have a feeling some of you are probably going to have some player characters that are taller, but my player character actually very nicely fits. This is about where my player would run into the wall. My player actually fits in a single block going up this way. And my player has more than enough room, height-wise, to have 2 blocks in front, right? And remember, if I hide this upper level like this, we've put the bottom part on this lower level. So it's basically just painted on the ground. But that's just because we want the player to be able to show up in front of this wall. So if I wanted to make a really tall wall, I could just put the bottom 2 layers on the ground level like this. And then I could put more layers on the top level like this, and then add in my top part here, and then adjust my wall a little bit. Since this one is super tall, like if I were to make like a really, really tall thing like this, I would probably give the player a little bit more room to walk behind it. But again, it's really just a matter of thing. If you pay attention to these kind of things while you play games, you'll find a lot of top-down games would probably just go ahead and put the wall all the way up here as well, especially if it was like a lining wall at the bottom or like a visual piece. Or, you know, would probably put it somewhere down here where you can actually walk behind it so you know it's tall, but it's still got a pretty big base, kind of encouraging players to not cover up their line of sight. And this is pretty thin as well, so, you know, it's not like you're going to have a lot of space to lose yourself, but yeah, so if you wanted to do something like this, you could just add a bunch of the front wall part to the top layer, and you see it would still kind of come up through here. But you know what? It doesn't look bad. It's not super inefficient. It makes it very easy to design levels. You can walk in front and behind it. Again, the 20 is probably making it look a lot worse than it would with just the weapon because the 20 is not going to be there. But yeah, so that's one way to kind of add elevation, stuff like that very easily, without having to get into too much tedious work or making your own systems to sort out depth, all that kind of stuff. I figure in this kind of game, this is something people would want to know how to do, so yeah. And to be honest, our enemies are pretty simple, right? So our enemies can very easily get caught on terrain and stuff like that, so you probably don't want to make a level that's too complex unless you want to have some crazy AI for enemies. You know, so I'm going to add a couple walls down here just for fun and for testing. But really, if my enemies are going to get caught up on any walls, I want it to be one of these open ones where they can still fire bullets at the player. So that way the player can't just abuse the collisions too much. So I'm going to add in some of my own walls. I'm also going to add this top part here to the upper ground level instead of having it to the lower one, so that way if stuff gets shot behind it, it shows up behind it, all that. So I'm going to do all that real quick, set up some walls, and then we'll be ready to move on. Okay, so I added a couple walls in the bottom, added the actual wall objects here, and first of all, I renamed this layer ground top because I feel like that just makes more sense. Then ground level 2. Remember, always do whatever floats your boat, so if it works for you, it works for you. I separated this top part out and the tops of these onto the ground top tile layer like this. And as you can see, all the walls I made sure are on the actual ground layer itself, so the player can walk in front of them. Cool. So that's about all I'm going to cover for tiles. Just as a last note, remember to check your depths and to unlock new layers that you make and make sure that they're at an appropriate depth. And the way that we have the depth code sort of sorting with our, like for instance, our player and our object crates, which we could put some crates around if we want to. All of these are using negative Y coordinates or negative bounding box coordinates. So remember that pretty much all of our objects getting dynamic depth are going to be in the negative. So anything like tile layers, they want to be under crates and players and enemies. All those should probably just be positive. 0 or greater than 0. And then like for our ground top, we set it to a really low negative number so that way it always shows up on top of any of these things. So cool, nice. Now we kind of know how to set up our rooms visually. We've got a couple tips in terms of using tile sets with level design and stuff like that. And the main thing is now we have a camera that we can walk around with, and we have a big room to do stuff in. It takes me kind of a long time to record these things, so thinking back, I don't know how long this section of the video is going to be, but hopefully I can edit it down to be pretty quick because I didn't want to spend too much time on it. Anyways, now we're moving on to advancing our enemy behavior.
Okay, thank you for letting me indulge in making my game want to look prettier while we're in the middle of this big project. Like I said, next time's more enemy stuff, including bigger topics like state machines, and also a few different smaller things, so be ready for that. Shouldn't be anything too complicated. As always, super special thanks to all my patrons on the left there, and an extra special thanks to Nixionic, Red Dragon Redemption, Null, Joseph Sandlin, Midnight, Jericho Deloach, Mark, Aogio, Homeless Bums Ahoy, Skelenthrax, Captain Ludwig, and Christian Donovan. Thanks so much again, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye-bye now.